Good morning. So I'm just going to talk about bandwidth prediction in low latency live applications. And everybody knows how to do low latency, but then bandwidth prediction is another problem that everybody needs to deal with. So this is a joint work with my colleagues, with Christian Timmer from Klagenfurt University, Austria, and Abdul Haq Bentaleb and Roger Zimmerman from National University of Singapore. So we published a paper last month, and we presented this in the ACM NOSTAF conference a month ago. And I'll also share the paper along with the slides later. So feel free to look at the paper in more detail. So we collected lots of Twitch data in the past, and I know that there are some Twitch folks in the room, and bandwidth measurement has been somewhat a problematic thing for Twitch and many other low latency live applications. So this is just the data we collected from Twitch back in November, and this is a bandwidth regime we applied to the Twitch player inside the network. So we are using their player, but we are just changing the available bandwidth to the client, and wanted to see what would happen in terms of bandwidth prediction and adaptation. So as you can see, we changed the bandwidth between 1 and 5 megabit per second. So these are the measured bandwidths by the Twitch player. As you can see, regardless of what kind of bandwidth was available to the client was more or less always measuring about 2.4 megabit per second. Obviously, this is a problem because we are not either upshifting or downshifting. We are kind of, pretty, constant in terms of bitrate, and that gives you either underutilization or a lot of stalling during the playback. So the client, based on this measurement, it will go with this requested bitrate at 2 megabit per second. Well, when you have 5, you ask for 2, you are okay. You are just underutilizing the network. But then when there is 1 and you are still asking for 2, well, we know what's going to happen. You are going to run out of data in your buffer. So it's really the problem because the client is not really able to predict the bandwidth accurately. So this is why it's happening. This is a complicated diagram, but if you look at in pieces, it will make a lot of sense. So we have a game, live sports here. Time goes from right to left. And then, on the server side, we are generating all these segments and chunks. Each color is denoting a different segment, and the individual pieces are chunks. The non-low latency client is obviously making a request for a segment, getting the segment, and then making another request for the next segment, and so on. Now, for the low latency client, it makes a request, and whatever is available on the server until that time, it will get it in batch. But as soon as the server runs out of data, because the data is not generated yet, it's a live application, it will generate the chunk and then it will send it off. So that means we will actually get a network transmission as shown here. The first larger batch, and its size depends on your request time, obviously, is going to be probably a bit larger than a few chunks, and the remaining chunks are going to be just chunk size. Now, this first batch is transmitted by the server at the network speed because the data is available, and the only limiting factor is the network speed. That's what we call a transmission network limited chunk transfer. The later chunks, which are the individual chunks, are what we call them as source limited chunks. In that case, since they are generated by the server, network is not necessarily the bottleneck for those chunks. In that case, you really don't want to measure the bandwidth because what you are measuring is really quite underrepresentation of the available bandwidth. Now, the question is if we can identify these chunks from each other, the network limited and then source limited. So that's the whole idea behind this work. So we came up with a method, what we call as ACTE, ABR for chunk transfer encoding. So we are doing the regular bandwidth measurement. We start the timer when we send a request. We stop the timer when we receive a response, look at the response size, and so on. And we are using a slow sliding window averaging method that everybody uses here. Nothing really much new here. And then we do prediction, and then that goes into an adaptive filter. That's an important factor in this work. And then based on that, we run the ABR controller algorithm so that it can upshift, downshift, or stay at the same bit rate. Now, this is what most players are currently doing as well. But the identifying the unique feature of our method is what chunks go into the bandwidth measurement and what chunks are ignored in the bandwidth measurement. So we implemented this in Dash.js, the open source. The code is available, and we modified all these red blocks, the bandwidth measurement module, and then the bandwidth prediction module. So measurement is doing a measurement for the past events, and prediction is doing a prediction into the future. So that's how do we identify the good chunks, the ones that are actually network limited instead of source limited? So that's the question here. So if I look at the timeline, I'm going to see something like this. I will see a bunch of chunks, somewhat really close to each other, and then some other chunks that are kind of separate from each other on the network side. So each chunk has a size, that we can determine from the response. And what we need is the chunk reception duration. So the beginning and the end times. So unfortunately, the current MSE stack that we use for JavaScript players, it doesn't really tell us when the chunk request time, because there's not really an exact time when the chunk transmission is going to start on the server side. So that's an unknown for us. The chunk download end time, we can see that from our own stack, which is good. And we know the size from the response, as I said. Now, all we need is this B values, the beginning of the chunk transmission times. Now, if you don't have that information, and we don't, you can just try to predict what it is. Now, if the B value for the next chunk is close to the E value of the previous chunk, that means they are really back-to-back, so they are source limited. They are network limited. If it is not, then they are source limited. So in this case, the first two chunks are the good chunks that I want to include in my bandwidth measurement, and the other two chunks are the bad chunks that I don't want to include, because otherwise I'm going to make a mistake. Now, without the B values, how do we do this? We have a reasonable assumption, which seems to hold for most cases. Idle periods inside a chunk cannot happen. I mean, there is no idle time, idle transmission during a chunk transfer. The idle times can only exist between the segments. Also, for each chunk, we download the download rate by using the previous chunk end time and the current chunk end time instead of the beginning time, and we try to measure its speed as compared to the segment download rate. If it is within a small margin, well, we say that it is source limited, and we discard it. It is that simple. If the chunk download rate is within a segment download rate, that shows that it's a bad chunk, and that's not supposed to be included in the bandwidth prediction. Otherwise, we have a good chunk, and that's what we take into account in our bandwidth prediction. So once you have the good chunks, you just apply a sliding window approach to get the meaningful idea what's happening inside the network. So we use the last three values. It's not really a very huge sliding window. We use the last three good chunk bandwidth measurements, and we input this into a filter so that we can extract the information for the next adaptation point. So the way we optimize our algorithm, and that's where the ABR controller comes into the picture, well, we have a certain objective function which you can actually change for your client, but here it is ours. We try to first minimize the prediction error, because once we predict something, soon later we will be able to measure whether it was really a good prediction or not. So we can calculate the error so that we update the filter coefficients, which will give us hopefully a better prediction in the next step. We also want to improve the quality as much as we can based on a certain equation that I will show. And then we have a target latency, we have available bandwidth, and then we would like to keep at least some amount of data in our buffer for sudden changes. So I'll skip this. It's a CMAF setup, and the approaches we have compared our method against, they are listed here. So some people use segment-based last bandwidth. So they look at the bandwidth of the last segment. There is chunk-based exponentially moving average. Well, that's also used, but again, it is not really identifying bad or good chunks, so it's computing over the entire list of chunks. There's a chunk-based sliding window. It's a bit different than the second one. That's also commonly used. And then we have Will's simple side load. So this is a method invented by Will Low over here. So what he does is he requests earlier segment that's already available at the cache, edge cache, so that while you are doing a side download, you actually try to measure the bandwidth over a larger file size. Obviously, this adds up to your network consumption, but if you have enough bandwidth, that's not really a big deal. So we use a couple of different QoE metrics, which are not really ours. We just borrowed from some other people and some ITU standards. And then the last slide I want to show you is just a quick comparison against all these methods. So we have ours at the top and then a bunch of other throughput-based bandwidth measurement algorithms. There is BOLA, dynamic, and some of them are sliding windows, some of them are moving average over with exponential coefficients. So the goal was here to avoid the stalls as much as possible. And then obviously not really upshift, downshift unnecessarily. So you want to retain a consistent quality over time. And then also try to stay within the desired low latency. So you don't want to really have like 5-second or 10-second latency, because in that case all these algorithms are going to work just fine. So the code is available, the paper is available online. I'll be putting those in the shared folder as well. So just final note, this paper actually got a DASH Excellence in Dash Award a month ago. So yeah, thank you.